Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today we are doing a deep dive into the source material that, well, shapes our theology and the way we understand the world. And I want to start by having you imagine something.
Yeah, picture the most degrading, socially repulsive word you can think of.
Right. I'm talking about a word meant to completely strip away a person's humanity. A word that reduces a living, breathing human being to, well, to a piece of property, an item on a ledger, a disposable tool.
It is a harsh concept to sit with.
It really is. Now, imagine a group of people starting a global movement in the first century, taking that very word and voluntarily wearing it like a crown.
Which is wild when you look at the historical context.
Yeah. Today, we are opening up the ancient Greek dictionary to investigate a single word, and that word is doulos. Our mission here is to trace a historical shockwave. We're going to look at how a word that ancient Greeks viewed with absolute unmitigated disgust.
And we really do mean disgust.
Oh, yeah. A word describing the lowest possible social and legal class. We're going to see how that became the supreme title of honor for early Christians.
And for you listening, whether you are, driving to work or sitting at your desk, this matters.
Yeah, because understanding this massive linguistic shift alters our entire understanding of human autonomy. If you have ever read historical texts or English translations of the New Testament, you have probably seen this word smoothed over.
Right. Translators usually write servant.
Servant, yeah. We are going to strip away that polite gloss to reveal the shocking historical reality behind the vocabulary.
And that polite gloss is a massive barrier for modern readers. I mean, when you hear the word servant today, your mind immediately goes to the hospitality industry.
Right, you think of a butler or maybe a maid.
Yeah, a barista, a chauffeur, you think of a profession. But doulos is not a profession. In the ancient world, it is an ontological category.
An ontological category, meaning it defines your actual state of being.
Spot on. Strictly defined in the Greek language, a doulos is the direct polar opposite of the word eleutheros.
And eleutheros translates to free, right?
Right. Free. A doulos is a male slave, viewed purely as an entity within a socioeconomic context. He is property. He's entirely stripped of legal personhood.
Let's lay the groundwork by looking at the Greek labor market, because the sources we have are very clear about the distinctions here. To really grasp the horror of the doulos in the classical Greek mindset, we have to look at the other words they used for people who worked for a living.
Because there were a lot of different words.
Yeah. For example, the texts frequently mention the word oiketes.
Yes, and oiketes is a household domestic. The mood of that word is oikos, which means house or family.
So they are tied to the family.
They are. This person might still be bound to the household, but they are integrated into the family dynamic. They are the cooks, the tutors, the people making the meals.
Okay, that makes sense.
Philo of Alexandria, he was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, he noted that the oikotai share the life of the family. They have a certain social buffer because they are viewed, in some small way, as part of the household's identity.
Right. They live under the roof, they raise the kids, they participate in the daily rhythm of the home.
Yeah, exactly. Well, precisely.
And then you have the mistheos, or the misthotos, which is the hired day laborer. Now, wait a minute. From a purely economic standpoint, a day laborer might actually have a much harder life than a doulos, right?
Absolutely. Right.
Because if there is a drought or if the economy tanks and no one is hiring down at the marketplace, the day laborer starves.
They have no safety net.
Right. But the doulos, being a valuable piece of property, is going to be fed by their master, if only to protect the financial investment. So why did the Greeks consider the slave to be infinitely worse off?
Because the Greeks did not measure human value by caloric intake or, job security.
Yeah.
They measured it by legal standing.
Ah.
The day laborer lived a precarious, hand-to-mouth existence, sure, but they possessed one thing the doulos lacked completely, and that is legal autonomy.
They had a choice.
Right, they had a choice. They could theoretically walk away from a terrible employer, even if walking away meant going hungry.
But the doulos couldn't.
No. The doulos was classified as a res. That's a Latin legal term meaning an object of property. In Greek, they were often referred to simply as a soma.
A soma, just a body.
Just a body. A slave could be bought, sold, leased, given away as a gift, left in a will, or used as a pledge for a mortgage.
Used as collateral for a loan. That is, wow, you are not a person. You are a financial asset securing a line of credit.
Precisely. To understand the Greek mind, we have to look at how their greatest philosophers categorize these individuals. Aristotle, in his work on politics, gives us a brutal definition.
What does he call them?
He categorizes a slave simply as an animate tool, The Greek phrase is empsychon organon,
Empsychon organon, a living instrument.
a tool that breathes.
That is chilling.
Yeah. Aristotle argued that just as a carpenter uses a hammer or a saw to build a table, the master uses the slave to conduct the business of living.
Because a hammer has no will of its own.
Right, it exists solely to execute the will of the carpenter. The slave, according to this philosophy, has no independent will. They exist solely to execute the discretionary will of the master.
So they're physically alive, but legal.
Legally and socially, they have zero status as a person. Diogenes Laertius summed up the legal reality spot on. He said, "A servile head has no rights."
I mean, think about modern employment versus this ancient concept of ownership. If you work a tough job today, even a grueling job with a terrible boss who micromanages your every move.
Which a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, right. But you still hit the end of your shift. You clock out, you get in your car, you drive home, and you regain your autonomy.
Your boss does not own your weekend.
Exactly. Your boss does not own your hobbies. But a doulos never clocks out. Their very breath, their physical output, the fruit of their labor, it all belongs entirely to the master.
It is like a tree, right? The owner of the tree automatically owns the apples it produces.
That total loss of autonomy, that was the ultimate nightmare for the classical Greek citizen, wasn't it?
Oh, without a doubt. The core of classical Greek identity was self-rule. To be subject to an alien will, to have someone else dictate your existence, that was considered a severe perversion of human nature.
They found their personal dignity in the fact that they answered to no one but themselves in their city-state.
Which explains their intense political reactions to things. They looked at the Persian Empire, where everyone was essentially a subject to the great king, and they just felt sheer contempt.
They viewed the Persians as a nation of natural slaves.
Absolutely. The Greeks fought fiercely for political independence because the alternative was unthinkable. The philosophers debated this constantly.
Plato writes about this, right?
Yeah, Plato depicts the ideal of the sophists in his dialogue, the Gorgias. The argument is made by characters like Callicles that a truly happy human is one who bows to no one.
Bows to no one.
Right. The ideal life is one where your own desires are as large as possible, and you have the courage and intelligence to satisfy those desires without anyone ever telling you no.
So any form of submission is a weakness.
A defect in your character, yeah.
A happy human bows to no one. That is the ultimate declaration of self-rule. But didn't Plato introduce a caveat to that? He didn't agree entirely with the sophists' free-for-all mentality, did he?
He did not. Plato argued against the purely selfish view of the sophists, but he still maintained that bowing to a human master was degrading. The only exception Plato allowed was being a slave to the laws, the nomoi.
Meaning the constitution of the city-state, like the objective rules governing Athens.
Correct. And notice the distinction he is drawing there. The law is a super-individual ideal. It is an abstract, objective standard that secures the stability of the entire city.
So for Plato, submitting to the law is what makes you a good citizen.
It actually guarantees your freedom by preventing anarchy. But you are never, ever supposed to be a slave to a person. Submitting to the arbitrary will of another human being would strip you of your dignity.
Okay, so if the Greeks found this submissiveness mathematically impossible for a free citizen, how does that translate to their theology?
That is where it gets really interesting.
Right, because if the idea of losing autonomy was their greatest horror in the marketplace, what happens when they go to the temple?
It creates this massive religious disconnect. When you analyze classical Greek religion, you notice a glaring absence in their vocabulary. Worshippers never, ever referred to themselves as the doulos of Zeus.
Or the doulos of Apollo.
Right, never.
Which is totally counterintuitive for us, because when you picture ancient pagan religions, you usually picture people groveling in the dirt before giant marble statues, begging for mercy from terrifying deities.
That is a popular misconception, at least regarding the Hellenistic world. The Greeks viewed the gods largely in terms of family relationships or friendships. The Greek word they used is philos.
Philos, like brotherly love or friendship.
Yeah. Remember, their mythology is full of gods who have very human characteristics, human flaws, and human traumas. The gods are essentially just amplified humans with immortality and specific jurisdictions over nature.
They get jealous, they hold grudges, they have petty arguments over who gets golden apple.
Exactly. And because of that familiarity, the relationship between a Greek citizen and a god was highly transactional and relational. It was not based on absolute subjection. We see this vividly in their physical posture during worship.
Oh, really? What was their posture?
There was no kneeling in standard Greek religious ceremonial.
None at all. They just stood there.
They stood upright, often with their arms raised toward the sky. Kneeling was the posture of a doulos before a master, or a defeated enemy before a conqueror. A free Greek citizen would not degrade himself by kneeling, not even before the king of the gods.
Wow.
The only exception, and this really proves the rule, is that Greeks would occasionally kneel to chthonic deities.
Chthonic meaning underworld gods, like Hades and Persephone.
Yes, deities associated with the earth and the underworld. But the historical sources are very clear. They did not kneel to show subjection to these gods.
Then why do it?
They knelt purely to get their mouths physically closer to the ground, so their voices would reach the underworld more easily.
So it's just a practical acoustic maneuver.
It had absolutely nothing to do with gesturing absolute submission.
This feels less like a religion requiring total allegiance and more like, I don't know, paying your monthly dues to a local homeowners association.
That's a great way to put it.
You offer the sacrifice to keep the city safe, to fulfill your end of the contract, and the god fulfills their end by sending rain or protecting the ships.
That captures the mechanical aspect of it perfectly. It functioned very much like a civic duty. It lacked the crushing, overwhelming sense of absolute majesty that demands total self-surrender. Because, to a Greek, self-surrender is slavery, and slavery is the ultimate evil.
If you think the highest human good is self-rule, you cannot logically worship a deity that demands the surrender of that self-rule. You have to invent gods that fit within your philosophical boundaries.
Yes, and we see this logic perfectly illustrated by the Cynic philosophers. That was a school of thought that gained massive popularity. A philosopher like Epictetus taught that the wise man is essentially a king.
A king of his own mind.
Right. He is perfectly free because he controls his own mind and maintains a state of apatheia.
Apatheia, which is freedom from emotional disturbance.
Yes. Anyone who lacks wisdom, who gives in to their passions or fears, is a slave to their desires. But the philosopher, he would never call himself a slave to God. He considered himself God's associate, God's colleague.
God's colleague. Like, hey, Zeus, let's touch base on Thursday to align our agendas.
Very much.
The sheer arrogance of that is staggering.
It is the logical endpoint of their worldview. If autonomy is the highest good, then a relationship with the divine must preserve that autonomy at all costs. You can be a friend of the gods, you can negotiate with them, but you cannot be owned by them.
So this Hellenistic mindset is hitting a massive wall when it travels east. While the Greeks are treating the gods like civic partners, the East has a completely different paradigm for authority. And this linguistic collision happens in Alexandria, Egypt.
To unpack this collision, we have to look at the Septuagint.
Right, the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Exactly. The Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, created by Jewish scholars a couple of centuries before the time of Christ. They were translating the texts for the massive Greek-speaking Jewish populations spread throughout the Mediterranean.
So the scholars are sitting in the Library of Alexandria, they are looking at the Hebrew scrolls, and they hit the Hebrew word ebed.
Yes,
Yeah.
ebed. In Hebrew, that broadly denotes a worker, a subordinate, or a slave. And the translators had to find the right Greek equivalent. They had a menu of options.
They could have used oipetes, right?
Yeah, identifying the person as a household domestic. They could have used mistheos, identifying them as a hired worker. They could have even used diakonos, which means a table waiter or an attendant.
But they didn't.
No. Time and time again, they bypassed those softer words and chose the harshest, most absolute word available in the Greek language, doulos.
Why apply a word that carries all the cultural baggage of being a living tool, an object of property to the people of God?
Because of the political and cultural reality of the ancient Near East. In the East, the king was not a first among equals, like a Greek politician or an Athenian magistrate.
Right.
The king was an absolute, undisputed monarch.
Mm-hmm.
All subjects, no matter how high-ranking they were in the government, were completely at the disposal of the monarch. Their lives, their property, their status, everything existed at the king's pleasure.
The records of ancient diplomacy show us exactly how this played out. We have correspondence recorded in the historical books like 2 Kings. King Ahaz of Judah is threatened by a massive coalition of enemies.
The Arameans and the Israelites.
Right. So he writes a desperate letter to Tiglath-Pileser, the terrifying king of the Assyrian Empire, asking for military intervention. And his opening line is, "I am your slave and your son."
In the presence of greater authority, the only polite, appropriate posture was absolute self-abasement. Ahaz is a king himself. He wears a crown, he sits on a throne, he commands armies, yet he voluntarily calls himself a doulos.
But there is a crucial nuance we cannot miss here. The subjects called themselves slaves to show reverence. The king rarely called them slaves to their faces in a derogatory way.
Exactly. It was a voluntary verbal submission to a greater authority, initiated by the subordinate.
It is a diplomatic protocol saying, "Your wish is my command. I have no rights before you. I exist to execute your will."
Yes. And this royal court language was naturally adopted into Jewish worship. If you approach a human king with that level of absolute subjection, how much more should you approach the creator of the universe?
Because God is the ultimate sovereign king.
Therefore, calling oneself a doulos of God was not degrading. It was a title of intense reverence and exclusivity.
If we think about this logically, it's really a matter of perspective. If God is infinitely high, completely sovereign, possessing all authority, and humans are created beings fashioned from dust, the only rational, mathematically correct posture is absolute subjection.
It's just facing facts.
Yeah. To claim autonomy before the creator is just delusional. By calling yourself God's property, you are actually recognizing reality. And paradoxically, being owned by the creator elevates you.
It elevates you vastly above any other human status. In the Hebrew scriptures, the highest honor a human being can receive is to be called the doulos of God.
And they don't just hand that title out lightly.
Not at all. It is applied to the absolute titans of the faith. Moses is the doulos of God, Joshua, Abraham, David. The prophets are collectively called God's slaves.
It implies a fiercely exclusive relationship.
You cannot be the slave of God and the slave of a pagan idol simultaneously. You are totally committed to one sovereign will.
So we have these two massive tectonic plates of culture grinding against each other. The Greek plate, where being a doulos is a horror and autonomy is the highest good.
Right.
And the Eastern plate, where being the doulos of the sovereign lord is the ultimate badge of honor. These plates violently collide in the first century during the Roman occupation.
And that sets the stage for the teachings of Jesus.
To appreciate the weight of what Jesus is teaching, we have to look unblinkingly at the legal reality of the first century Roman Empire.
Which was brutal. Slaves in the Roman Empire had no legal rights whatsoever. They could not legally marry. Their unions were called contubernum.
Contubernum, meaning just cohabitation.
A mere cohabitation that the master could break up at any time. Legally, any money a slave held belonged to the master, creating a legal fiction called the peculium.
I want to make sure I grasp the peculium. A slave could run a business, right? They could be a merchant, make a massive profit, and hold on to the cash. But legally, that cash was not theirs.
Correct. The master allowed them to hold the funds to incentivize hard work and enterprise, but the master retained ultimate legal ownership of every single coin.
So the master could just take it back.
The master could revoke the peculium at a moment's notice. Furthermore, a slave's family ties were not legally recognized. They had no official genealogies. A master could separate a husband and wife or a mother and child and sell them to different provinces at whim.
The law provided zero protection from physical abuse either.
None. A master could physically punish, brand, or mutilate a slave. Even if a slave was violently abused, bringing a legal case against a master was practically impossible.
Because they couldn't testify, right?
Under Roman law, slaves could not testify in court unless they were being actively tortured.
Wait, unless they were tortured.
Yes. The legal assumption was that a slave would always lie unless pain forced the truth out of them.
That is just, wow. That is a system built on total domination and terror. And yet Jesus uses this very stark, unvarnished reality in his parables. He does not shy away from it, and he does not soften the blow.
He embraces the terminology.
He uses the brutal logic of the doulos system to illustrate human responsibility to God.
He does. Look at the parable he tells in Luke chapter 17. He describes a slave who's been out in the field all day doing back-breaking agricultural labor, plowing the rocky Judean soil, tending the sheep.
Just exhausted.
The slave comes inside, completely drained. But Jesus points out that the master does not say, "Sit down, put your feet up, let me get you some dinner."
The master says, "Put on your apron, prepare my supper, and wait on me while I eat and drink. Afterward, you can eat."
And Jesus concludes the parable by asking his audience, does he thank the slave because he did what was commanded?
And the answer is obvious.
To any first-century listener, it is absolutely not. And the application Jesus makes to his disciples is staggering. He says, "So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, "We are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done."
That flies directly in the face of our modern sensibilities.
Oh, completely.
We want a trophy for just showing up. We want God to be endlessly grateful for our slight moral efforts, for our church attendance, for our charity. But Jesus is saying, you do not negotiate with God. You owe him your complete obedience. When you obey, you are just fulfilling your baseline function as a created being.
It shatters the Greek idea of being a colleague with the divine. You do not touch base with God to align agendas. You execute his will.
Right.
And Jesus pushes this even further when he addresses the impossibility of split loyalties. In Matthew 6, he says, "No one can work for two masters." Now, modern readers often interpret that as a light metaphor about prioritizing your daily schedule.
Like balancing work and family.
Right. But in the ancient world, it was a reference to a specific legal nightmare.
You could literally be owned by two different people at the same time.
Yes. In antiquity, fractional or joint ownership of a slave was a known legal reality. It could happen through inheritance, say two brothers jointly inherit their father's estate, including the household slaves.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or it could happen if a highly skilled slave was jointly purchased by a syndicate of investors. Sometimes a slave was legally freed by one fractional owner, but not the other, leaving them half free and half slave.
The conflicting demands would tear a person apart. One owner demands you go to the market in the morning. The other owner demands you work in the vineyard.
It was an impossible situation to manage. The demands of two sovereign wills will inevitably clash. Jesus uses this precise, well-known legal friction to show that devotion to God cannot be split.
You cannot be a doulos to God and a doulos to mammon.
To wealth, property, and worldly security. Because when the commands conflict, you will inevitably favor one over the other. Total allegiance cannot be divided.
The Apostle Paul addresses another specific psychological reality of the slave system in his letters. He uses a brilliant Greek word, ophthalmodoulia.
Ophthalmodoulia. It literally translates to eye service.
Eye service.
Paul addresses this in his letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians. He tells Christian slaves not to work with eye service as men pleasers.
I think anyone who has ever worked in a corporate office understands eye service. It is when you are browsing the internet, scrolling on your phone, and the moment you hear the boss's footsteps approaching your cubicle, you furiously start typing on a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
You only put in the effort when the eye of the master is physically on you.
It is the natural self-defense mechanism of someone who lacks inner motivation. The slave has no equity in the business. They do not profit from a bumper crop in the harvest.
So naturally, the psychological response is to do the bare minimum required to avoid a beating.
Right. And Paul addresses this by radically shifting the slave's motivation. He says, "Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you work for."
I have to stop right there and ask the hard question. If the institution of slavery was this brutal, this degrading, this destructive to human dignity, why didn't the New Testament writers just call for a political revolt?
It's a question everyone asks.
Why didn't Paul Spartacus his way through Rome and command all Christians to violently dismantle the system immediately? We read these texts and we want a fiery abolitionist manifesto, but we get instructions on how to work heartily. Why?
It is a vital question, and understanding the answer requires historical perspective. The New Testament bypassed armed political revolt for a completely different strategy.
Because revolts didn't work.
Political revolts, like the one led by Spartacus, ended in mass slaughter. Spartacus's rebellion resulted in 6,000 slaves being crucified along the Appian Way. Armed rebellion did not change the underlying legal structures, it just entrenched the paranoia of the masters.
So what was the strategy?
The early Christian message introduced a radical internal equalizer that hollowed out the institution from the inside.
How does an internal equalizer dismantle an economic system?
By taking the master and the slave and placing them on the exact same footing before the cross of Christ. Paul tells the masters that they too have a master in heaven, and there is no partiality with him.
He tells the slaves that they are the Lord's freedmen.
Then he tells the free masters that they are Christ's slaves. The socioeconomic categories were suddenly swallowed up by a massive theological reality.
Think about the mechanics of the early church gatherings. You have a Roman patrician, a wealthy master, sitting next to his own household slave at the Lord's table. They are taking communion together.
Sharing the same bread.
Right. They are both confessing that they are wretched sinners saved entirely by the grace of a crucified Savior. The master has to recognize the slave not as an animate tool, but as a brother, a joint heir of the universe.
That shared identity dissolves the ontological distinction of slavery. You cannot permanently treat someone as an object of property if you recognize that the creator of the universe shed his blood to redeem them.
The letter to Philemon illustrates this perfectly, doesn't it?
It does. Paul sends a runaway slave, Onesimus, back to his master Philemon, but commands Philemon to receive him no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. The legal structure of slavery was starved of its ideological oxygen.
That is an inside-out revolution, and it leads directly into the way the leaders of this new movement identified themselves. They took this despised word and weaponized it. They wore it like a badge of honor.
They absolutely did. Look at the opening lines of the epistles in the New Testament. Paul, James, Jude, and Peter, they all open their letters by introducing themselves.
But they do not list their academic credentials.
No, they do not highlight their social standing. Paul writes, Paulos doulos iso Christo. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ.
James says it, Jude says it, Peter says it. It is ubiquitous across the texts.
And we must understand the social dynamics at play here. This is not false modesty. When an apostle calls himself a doulos of Christ, he is making a breathtaking assertion of absolute authority.
Wait, how does calling yourself a piece of property give you authority over anyone?
Because of who the master is. In the ancient Roman world, the social status of a slave was directly tied to the social status of their owner. A slave of a poor provincial farmer had no influence, but an imperial slave,
Like a slave of Caesar.
right, a member of the familia Caesaris, they had vastly more social weight than a free peasant. A slave managing the emperor's treasury in Rome could have wealthy, freeborn senators waiting outside his door begging for a favor.
Because to defy the slave is to defy the emperor.
The imperial slave could give orders to free men because those orders carried the full weight and backing of the emperor.
Ah. So when Paul introduces himself as a slave of Jesus Christ, he is saying, I am completely owned by the risen Lord of the cosmos. Therefore, I answer to no human authority. And when I speak to your church, I speak with the backing of the owner.
That is the brilliant paradoxical claim. He is simultaneously claiming total subjection to Christ and absolute independence from the judgments of human courts or critics.
He says in Galatians, if I were still trying to please men, I would not be a slave of Christ.
You cannot be a people pleaser and a doulos of God. Your allegiance is locked to a single sovereign.
This plays heavily into the early Christian theology of redemption. The word redemption itself is an economic term, ripped straight out of the marketplace.
Yes, it is steeped in the language of the slave market. The Christian premise is that humans are not naturally free. We are born into bondage. We are naturally slaves to sin, slaves to the law, and slaves to the elemental principles of the world.
We are born on the auction block, owned by a cruel master. Jesus says in John chapter 8, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin.
We think we are exercising our Greek autonomy when we sin, but we are actually just acting out the programming of our master. We are executing the will of a tyrant.
We have no natural ability to free ourselves. A slave cannot buy his own freedom if he has no property of his own, and spiritually we are bankrupt. So Christ's death on the cross is framed as an act of buying out.
The Greek term is exagorazo. Agora is the marketplace. Exagorazo means to buy someone out of the marketplace so they are never put up for sale again.
Christ pays the purchase price.
His own blood. To buy the slaves out of that cruel market.
Here is the paradox of early Christian freedom. Freedom in the New Testament is never autonomy. It is never the sophist ideal of doing whatever you want and bowing to no one.
True freedom is being rescued from a destructive, abusive master, sin, and death, and voluntarily taking on the yoke of a perfect master.
You trade masters. Paul writes in Romans chapter 6, having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. Autonomy is an illusion. You're going to be owned by something. The only question is, who is the owner?
And this new ownership results in a legal change of status. The theological term is hyothesia.
Hyothesia, which translates to adoption as sons.
This is where the metaphor breaks the boundaries of Roman law. In Roman law, a master could free a slave, making them a freedman. The freedman still owed duties to his former master, who was now his patron.
But Christ goes infinitely further.
He buys the slave, frees the slaves, and then legally adopts the slave into his own family.
Let me try to put this into a modern corporate scenario. Imagine a hostile corporate takeover. You have employees trapped in a terrible predatory contract with a corrupt, failing company.
They are overworked, underpaid, and destined for financial ruin.
They cannot quit because the non-compete clauses are airtight. Then a benevolent CEO from a massive, successful corporation comes in. He buys the corrupt company out completely. He absorbs all the toxic debt. He tears up the abusive contracts.
I mean, he doesn't just let the employees wander off into unemployment.
Right. He brings them into his own headquarters, gives them shares in his company, and invites them to eat at his family table. They work for him now, but they work as partners, as family members, not as expendable assets.
That captures the legal and relational shift beautifully. The believer is legally bound to Christ, completely owned by him, but practically treated as a joint heir.
They belong to him, and that belonging is the source of their absolute security and joy.
And that brings us to the climax of this linguistic investigation. We have seen believers called slaves. We have seen prophets and apostles called slaves. But the most shocking use of this word in the ancient world applies to Jesus himself.
The Creator takes the lowest possible form. I'm looking at Philippians chapter 2, specifically verse 7. This text is widely considered one of the earliest Christian hymns. It says that Christ, who was in the form of God, emptied himself. And the Greek phrase for how he emptied himself is morphidou.
He took the form of a slave.
This is the theological epicenter of the New Testament, isn't it?
It is. Paul is not just stating that Jesus became a human being. Being human could mean being a Roman emperor, a wealthy merchant, or a respected philosopher. Paul specifies the exact rank Jesus assumed.
He took the morphidou.
He took on the lowest legal, social, and ontological status available in the human hierarchy.
He became property.
Yes. And the text points very specifically toward his death. Verse 8 says, he became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. We have to understand the mechanics of crucifixion to grasp this. Crucifixion was not just a painful method of execution. It was a highly specific legal penalty.
The Romans had a specific name for it, right?
They called it the supplicium servile, the slave's punishment.
Because Roman citizens could not be crucified, right? It was legally forbidden.
Generally, yes. Roman citizens, if condemned to die, were usually beheaded, which was considered a quick, honorable death. Crucifixion was deliberately engineered to be as degrading, prolonged, and humiliating as possible.
It was a billboard of Roman terror.
Reserved exclusively for slaves, rebels, and the absolute dregs of society. By being crucified, Jesus did not just die. He died the specific death of a condemned piece of property. He fully inhabited the morphidou.
Which makes the events of the Last Supper in John chapter 13 so incredibly vivid. Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples. The streets of Jerusalem are dusty, covered in animal waste. They enter the room for a banquet, and someone needs to wash the grime off the guests' feet.
Washing feet was an absolute necessity in the ancient world before reclining at a low table to eat. But that job was considered so menial, so degrading, that Jewish rabbinic law stated a Hebrew slave could not be commanded to do it.
So who did it?
It was exclusively the duty of a non-Jewish house slave, the lowest of the low.
And Jesus, the man they believe is the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who speaks galaxies into existence, takes off his outer garments. He wraps a towel around his waist, pours water into a basin, gets down on the dirt floor, and begins washing their feet.
Peter's reaction is very telling. He recoils in horror. He says, "You shall never wash my feet."
Peter's Greek mindset is bleeding through.
He cannot handle the cognitive dissonance of his Lord adopting the posture of a doulos. It violated every social boundary and theological assumption Peter held.
It completely shatters the Hellenistic worldview. For a Greek, a god might disguise himself as a human to come down to earth. Zeus might appear as a king or a warrior, but a god would never, ever take the form of a doulos.
It is mathematically impossible in their philosophical framework because a god, by definition, must be autonomous and supreme.
By voluntarily acting as a slave, Jesus was staging an aggressive reordering of human hierarchy. He tells them afterward, "If I then, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet."
He establishes a brand new kingdom ethic for the community. True greatness is not found in autonomy or dominating others. It is demonstrated by voluntarily taking the lowest position to benefit others.
That is a terrifying observation for human leaders. Think about the implications. If the Supreme Lord of the universe willingly takes the morphidou and washes the dirt off the feet of the people who are about to abandon him, it strips away any excuse for human arrogance.
It destroys the ability to pull rank.
If the CEO of the universe cleans the toilets, then no middle manager has the right to say, "That task is beneath me."
It eradicates pride at the root. The cynic philosopher thought he was free because he looked down on everyone else. The Christian is free because they are liberated to minister to everyone else, following the pattern of the master who became a slave for their sake.
We have covered massive ground today, from the Greek horror of losing autonomy, to the Eastern reverence for a sovereign king, to the harsh reality of Roman law, and finally to the stunning paradox of the Creator hanging on a Roman cross legally reserved for property.
The linguistic progression of the word doulos takes the darkest, most degrading realities of the human condition and flips them entirely upside down.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. As we mentioned at the beginning, English translators over the centuries have often felt incredibly uncomfortable with the word slave.
It carries such dark, painful baggage, especially in Western history.
So translators swapped it out for the polite word servant. But when we clean up the vocabulary, when we smooth down the sharp edges of the Greek text, we accidentally rob ourselves of the sheer shocking weight of what the early Christians claimed.
We absolutely do. We lose the scandal. We lose the radical nature of Christ's humility, and we lose the absolute, unyielding claim he has on those he has bought out of the market.
If you are comfortable being a servant of God, you might just be holding onto your autonomy, clocking out at 5, and keeping your weekends for yourself. But the text calls you to something vastly more demanding and infinitely more secure. The X-ray shows the jagged line. The word is doulos. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep investigating those ancient texts, keep questioning the polite translations, and we will see you next time on Informed Thinking.